thanks for coming out to hear this topic. Take a look at the book, Is the Bible Reliable or Holy? And I've got it holy with an E in it because for many people, there's this idea that the Bible is a book of superstition. It's not backed up by fact or data, and it's just basically believed in some less than intellectual way. So I want to look at that question. So just a bit about the Bible to start with. It is actually not one book. You can think of it more like a library, a document of 66 books, and they're written over a long period of time, over 1,500 years from the start to the end of the writing of the Bible. And it's written by a diverse set of authors. Over 40 authors wrote the Bible. And it's in two main parts. There's an Old Testament, which is basically the parts of the Bible that happened before Jesus comes, and it's written in Hebrew. The New Testament is written in Greek, and it written in this time period, 50 to 100 AD. It's got various books. You can hear the Gospels, there's history, there's letters. The bulk of the New Testament is letters. The Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they, you might say, are like biographies by contemporaries of Jesus about his life. I mentioned that the Bible is controversial, and one of the ways it's controversial is because it's an old book. You know, it's been around a long time. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about the Bible. And one of the main conspiracy theories is that the Bible has been changed. And depending on where the conspiracy theory is coming from, the person doing the changing varies in different theories. But there's an idea out there, the Da Vinci Code taps into it a lot. Even outside the Da Vinci Code, there's this idea that church people had some agenda. I know when I was a university student, a lot of my friends would say, well, there was some church, some pope, who wanted to keep people under their thumb, and what better way to keep people under their thumb than making up the story, because that gives the church power over people's lives. So is that true? And that was a question. Or did Constantine, and he'll come up in a little bit later, Constantine is the first Roman emperor to become a Christian. And so did he do something to mess around with the Bible? So in other words, were there things that were added to the Bible or taken out of the Bible over these 2,000 years since the New Testament was completed? What many people don't realize is there's actually a discipline. It's called textual criticism. And this discipline deals with that question. So you don't have to take it by faith. You don't have to take it by religion. You can take it with, just like we study linguistics or anything else, we can have a disciplined approach to answer those questions. And because it's a disciplined approach, this thing does not just apply to the Bible. It applies to any old writing from historical times. And so I want to give two main principles that's used in textual criticism to help answer that question, did this book get manipulated? And so to help us use these two principles, I'm going to use an example document. And in my example, there's an author. He lived 500 BC. I could pick any time, but I picked 500 BC. And he wrote some work. This would be close to where, Plato or Socrates, they were living around that time. Okay? So if we're going to be able to read it today, how does what he wrote all that long time ago get to us today? Well, what happened was, the original would be written on a papyrus scroll. It's like their version of paper. But paper doesn't last that long. After 50 years, the paper gets yellow. Well, over 200 years, it disintegrates. So what happened is, over time, either an invading army would come in and lose the paper, the document, the disintegrate, or a fire. It would get lost. The vast majority of works of antiquity are lost to us because it kind of ends right there where the original disappears. So for us to be able to read anything out of any author from antiquity, we have to have a transmission. What happened was there would be a professional class of people called scribes. And they can think of them as human photocopiers. Their job was to make a manuscript copy by hand from the original, and you can see my diagram here, there's a copy made. Okay? And that copy itself would only have a certain shelf life, wouldn't last that long. And so a copy is made of my copy. As you can see my line here, when it gets dashed, it means that manuscript has disappeared. We've lost it in some way. But the actual document is transmitted as the copies are made. So you have these documents, copies made of copies, and then you get to this, today we read in my example, okay, the third copy, it exists, somehow it's preserved through time. And what we're reading is this third copy. We don't read the original, we don't read the first copy, we don't read the second copy because they're lost to us, but we read the third copy. Now let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, that this third existing copy is year 500 AD. Okay? So what we have now is we can take our timeline from 500 BC to today and split it in two main parts. Okay? There's the part that comes after 500 AD. This is the document that was the copy that we're now reading today. And we know once the words are on the paper, on the papyrus, they don't change. You don't rearrange them or add once it's written down. So if the document has changed, the change has to come before this existing manuscript. So in my timeline here, so I call it the interval X. It could be any period of time. But so, for example, if the first copy, the scribe, who's copying the original, if he wanted to change the story, maybe he took something out, maybe he changed things or added something in, we don't have the original and the first to compare with to see if they're different, so we can't tell if he ever did it. So this is the area of textual uncertainty, where we don't have the various documents on hand to compare with. So the principle here is, the shorter this time period is, this what I call X, this period where we don't have the manuscripts to compare with, the shorter that is, the more reliable we can trust that this document hasn't changed. And conversely, the longer this interval is, and then there's more time for it because you have more manuscripts being generated that we can't compare with, there's more higher probability that this manuscript, this document has changed. So that's one principle. What we're doing is we're looking at the timelines. There's a second principle, and these manuscripts were never written in English. They were usually Greek, Hebrew, Latin, or something. But just for the sake of the example, my example here is in English. Okay? So let's say we found two of these manuscripts. And I'm reading along, and you can see here one says Joan is great, and the other one says John is great. So here's what we call a variant reading. So there's an A in one, there's an H in the other, and the change of the letter changes the person. One's talking about Joan, one's talking about John. So the question is, was the original author talking about Joan or John? In other words, is the A the mistake, or is the H the error? Well, if you only got two manuscripts, it's hard to figure out, right? But let's say we found two more. And now we've got four of them, and three of them say that Joan is great, and one says John is great. Well, it's highly unlikely that the same error comes in at the same spot three different times. So based on that, it's much more likely that John, the second manuscript, manuscript number 2, is the deviant or the copy that has got the error. So you see, as you have more manuscripts to work with and you can compare, you can actually, what you can do is you can work out where the errors are. So the principle is, the more manuscript copies you have to work with, the easier it is to detect the copy errors. So we have two principles of the Bible. We check the time span. We want to know when the author wrote it and when are the earliest extant manuscripts that we have on hand to read today, and what are the number of manuscript copies that we have to work with. And that's the discipline of textual criticism, and that allows us to get a handle on how accurate is this text that we're reading today. So, now I study forestry. In forestry, we always, we would do these experiments. In our experiments, we all had a control plot and the experimental plot. And the control plot was kind of like, we didn't add any fertilizer. We saw how the trees grew. And then we wanted to know, if we add fertilizer, does it enhance growth? And so we have a control compared with the experiment. But we're going to do that. We're going to have our control plot. And our control plot is the writings of the classical Greco-Roman writers. These writers inform us as to our understanding today of Greco-Roman history, basically Western civilization, the start of Western civilization, and its philosophy. So if you look down that list here, you'll see names, Caesar, Plato, Aristotle, that are very famous to us. Okay? Now if you look in the first column, rounded to the nearest 50 years, that's when that author lived. So since he lived there, that's when he wrote. So Caesar wrote about the year 50 BC, about his wars in Gaul. The second column over, the earliest copy, that's that earliest existing copy that's around today, that's the earliest one. So for example, the earliest copy of the works of Caesar is dated at the year 900 AD. And so the next column over is the difference between the two, the difference between when it was written and what the earliest copy. So if you think back to my timeline picture, that time span one is the interval X. It's when it was written to when's the earliest manuscript. And then the last column, number of copies, that's how many copies we have on hand in the world today of this author. So, there's 7 copies of Plato, of one work, and out of that, they translate them, and then they publish them and mass produce them for all the university students around the world when they're going to read the Republic of Plato, which I took in one of my philosophy courses. And so it's not based on a huge amount of textual manuscripts. Now, if you look down there, you look at it, just kind of ballpark it, you'll see that the time span, this interval, is roughly about 1,000 years. Some are a little bit more, some a little bit less. And the number of manuscripts you're dealing with is somewhere between 10 and 20. So that's kind of what our control is. That's what we use in university. Now, if you want to compare that with the New Testament, like I said, the New Testament is many different documents put into one. And so the earliest copy that we have of the New Testament is called the John Ryland manuscript. It's a portion of the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John was written around the year 90. So when written, 90. And this piece is dated around the year 130 AD. So 40 years after the Gospel of John was written is the date of the John Ryland manuscript. And then you keep going, so that you see there at the bottom of the papyrus, also a portion of the Gospel of John. It's dated a little bit later. But you can see it's like 100 years and down is the start of this timeline interval. Then you get the Chester Beatty, which are the writings of the epistles or the letters of Paul, kind of in a group. So Paul wrote around roughly around 60, and these are dated depending on who you're dating. Some dated, like you can see here, at 80 all the way up to 200. But you're within 100 years of the writings of Paul to the earliest extant manuscripts that we have of Paul today. I should have brought it. I forgot to bring it. But I have a big book at home that's this thick, and it's got the transcripts, photographs, and the transcripts in the Greek of all the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. And here's the preface of this. That's what it says. This book provides transcriptions of 69 of the earliest New Testament manuscripts, basically, as you can see, from the year 100 to the year 300. And they contain 2/3 of the text of the New Testament. This is very important, as we'll see here, but many people think that Constantine, he was the first Christian emperor, and he, in the year 325, maybe changed things around a little bit. All these manuscripts that we have in this book come from before Constantine. So I have to check. If Constantine changed the New Testament because of some decree or some pope in the year 500, these manuscripts will be different from the ones I'm using that come later. But we find actually that they're the same. They don't say anything different. So we actually have a check, and we can know, nothing to do with religious faith, nothing to do with superstition or belief, that Constantine or any of those people didn't change the Bible. Then you keep going, and there's I can't list them all, 69. But then you get, after that book, you get into what's called the codexes. And these are where the form, instead of being in a scroll now, they're in books, they're called. And the two famous are the Vaticanicus and the Sinaiticus. But they're basically only 200 to 300 years after. That's a complete New Testament. After the writings. So, and how many of these do we have altogether? I mean, I listed the first ones are 69, and we got some here. Well, we actually have over 24,000 manuscripts of portions of the New Testament. Many of them come from later, but we saw 69 of them come from within 100 to 200 years of the writings of the New Testament. And it's not even close, like the number 2 in terms of the number of manuscripts is the Iliad. But it's not even close, just 600. So if you want to do a visual of it, that's kind of how it is. You've got 650 of the Iliad versus 24,000 in the New Testament. So actually what we do, we have on hand, if you compare the experimental plot, that's we're testing the biblical records, compared with our control, which is the Greco-Roman philosophers and historians, here's the conclusion that the British Museum, what does he say? It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain. Now, does he say that for any religious reasons? Because he's a Christian, or he's belief in God, or anything like that? Those are, I don't know what this man's religion is, but that's not the reason he's using to say that the text of the Bible is certain. The reason he gives is solely related to the number of manuscripts, and then the time and the textual basis for the New Testament is so strong. And he'll say that no other book in the world is like it, in that point of view. And then he compares it with our control. He says, yeah, see the scholars, we have a handful of Greco-Roman writings, like 10 or 20, but here we have thousands. And so if we're willing to use these and say this is good enough, 10 to 20, and from the 10 to 20, we can access what Plato said, we can access what Aristotle said, surely therefore we have the textual basis to be confident in what John wrote and Matthew wrote and so on. So if you do a timeline, you can see it goes like this. Here's our 24,000 manuscripts, and they're basically, they start just within a few decades of when the New Testament was finished being written. And over a period of over 1,000 years, we have these manuscript copies that are available to us. And you can see here in my diagram here that we see Constantine. And so we have manuscripts that come from a couple hundred years before Constantine. So if he changed the story, or some pope in the Middle Ages changed the story, which I used to think maybe, I wasn't sure of, we would know it, because those early manuscripts would be different from the later manuscripts. And so our Bible today, when we read our Bible, is basically using these earliest manuscripts to give us a very sound and sure transcription of what the original authors wrote. So we have a very confident basis to believe, nothing to do with religion, that when I read the Bible, when I read the Gospel of John, I'm reading what John actually wrote. That's what it's showing me. Now, that doesn't prove that what John wrote was right to begin with. Maybe John made up a story. Right? But it narrows down the possibility.